welcome to Hence the Future podcast. I'm Justin Clark,
I'm Mattimore Cronin.
and today we're discussing the future of free will. This topic was recommended by one of our listeners, James Goutreau. Thank you, James. And it's something that Mattimore and I think about all the time. So maybe just to start, Mattimore, perhaps explain Sam Harris's argument for why free will is an illusion, and then we'll get into our own thoughts on free will.
Yeah, and when James recommended this topic, he also brought up Sam Harris's book on free will. And it's a pretty compelling book. He makes the case that you didn't pick your parents, you didn't pick your genes, you
Hmm.
didn't pick what neighborhood you were raised in, you didn't pick what ideas were drilled into you in school. You didn't
Hmm.
even pick your desires that you have, or
Yeah.
your capacity to fulfill those desires. So he argues that there is no free will. Free will is just an illusion. And if you look at the area in our life where we actually have control, it
Hmm.
essentially approaches zero. So
Yeah.
I have my own sort of thoughts on this, but I'd love to hear your thoughts first, Justin.
Yeah. So my thoughts on free will are a little bit different than Sam Harris's. I think his is sort of a reductionist view, but in my mind, it's not as it's not necessarily in line with the current laws of physics. I think his is more in line with the
Mm-hmm.
Newtonian determinism, where basically, if you know the state of the universe at any given time, then you can also predict the state of the universe at any point in the future. And I think
Yeah.
that's sort of what Sam Harris argues is like if we have a big enough computer, then we'll know exactly what people are thinking in the future because we'll
Right.
know the state of the universe, which includes, the atoms in our brain and the electrical signals and all of that stuff. So I think that type of thinking is maybe a little bit flawed because, there is uncertainty. The fundamental building blocks of the universe are or they behave probabilistically by nature. And that's, we kind of learn this with quantum mechanics. Now, I don't know how much quantum effects actually, you know, change our thought patterns. I don't know if there's, you know, a some sort of probability distribution for every atom in our brain that is collapsing at all different times. Maybe there's something that has to do with the many worlds theory here. If that is
Mm-hmm.
true, maybe there is all of these different worlds. So like we're just experiencing some path down, all these different probability distributions. I'm not really sure
Right.
how much it affects our thoughts and our thought patterns, but my guess is it affects us to some extent, and there is some sort of uncertainty just by the very nature of the building blocks of the universe. So those are sort of my initial thoughts. Is that there I think there's probably a bit of mix between free will and determinism. So there is some free will, meaning we're free to the extent that our brain structure lets us be free. So if you think of a probability distribution, maybe some people have a much larger probability distribution of their potential thought patterns. Maybe some people are doomed by their biology and their probability distribution of their thought patterns and actions is much narrower and much more predictable
Mm-hmm.
just by the very nature of their environment and everything else that led them to who they are today. So my thought is maybe babies are like the most free, right? So
Right.
babies have the most free will, and as we get older and older, our thought patterns become more and more ingrained. Our brain structure is
So you think
less
baby
broad.
Yoda has more free will than adult Yoda?
Probably. I
I
think
don't
I
know
think
about
adult
that because adult
well,
Yoda is still an enlightened being, but he also has the benefits of wisdom from growing up.
yeah, you're right. That's probably true. And he has more agency, can experience more things
He
and
can
like
control the
really know.
force.
Yeah, so I'm not saying that everybody they have less free will as they get older, but maybe there's like a change through time just by
Yeah.
the nature of like how our brains work.
Well, this is interesting, and it's a related point to what Sam Harris brings up as one of his examples, which is the son of Saddam Hussein, Hussein,
Hmm.
and he brings this up as a quintessential example that we would typically think of as someone who's a morally culpable person who really deserves to just be locked up and throw away the key. I mean, this guy helped
Hmm.
commit acts of terror. He murdered people. He did horrible things.
Hmm.
But at a certain point, he was a 4-year old. And
Yeah.
if we could see that 4-year old, we would send child services, we'd get him into a better home, we'd give him, all of the ideals of democracy taught to him in school, and we'd help him.
Hmm.
So, at what point does he go from being a 4-year old who's just a victim of his circumstances to someone who's essentially we consider like an evil villain that needs to be not only reprimanded and rehabilitated, but punished for his actions as a murderous 50-year-old? Is it when he turns 18 that we consider this person morally culpable? So, that I thought that was an interesting question to
Yeah.
frame.
Yeah, I'm not sure about this one. It's a hard question because as humans, we're very set on getting retribution and like getting revenge and like making sure people are punished for the things they did wrong. But at the same time, what, you know, what led him to where he is today? I mean, part of that is just being exposed to, his dad was a pretty shitty person as well, right? And there's a lot of
Yeah, I mean, he
things
grew
that,
up where your dad is Saddam Hussein.
yeah.
So you also, not only do you have the influence of having a father like that environmentally, you also have the biological influence of you actually sharing a lot of the same genes with your dad.
Hmm.
And then
Hmm.
you have Islamic fundamentalism drilled into you. You're in a war-torn country. Maybe
Hmm.
all the powerful people around you are members of a terror group. So you can see
Right.
how someone, like, if that's their world, it's
Hmm.
hard to say that anyone wouldn't go down that same path if they found themselves in the same circumstance. Just like the classic, if you grew up in Germany in the 1930s or 40s, can you really say that you would go against the Nazi party and put yourself and your family at risk? Or would you just kind
Hmm.
of like be like, hey, I don't want to make any waves. Like, yeah, I don't agree with this philosophy, but I'm not going to say anything outright and put myself in harm's way.
Yeah,
Um,
or your family. Yeah.
so that seems to be kind of what he's getting at. But
Hmm.
I mean, I think the way that Tim Urban thinks about free will is really helpful here because he put together this series called The Story of Us, and he thinks of it as everyone has a primitive self and you have a higher self. So your primitive self is essentially your like monkey reptilian brain that is just concerned about your biological needs. Like this is what Dawkins refers to in his book The Selfish Gene. Like it
Hmm.
basically is just whatever is needed for survival and reproduction and feeling safe within a large group and all of those very base
Hmm.
level needs. That's your primitive self. And then
Hmm.
your higher self is what what seeks truth, whether or not it's pleasant for your biological needs, like what like basically seeking those higher level ideals, values
Hmm.
and truth and freedom and those sorts of things. And it's interesting when you bring up like 4-year-old Hussein as opposed to 50-year-old, because everyone is sort of like a little mini yogi when they're like a little baby. Like
Hmm.
you're just like tripping on mushrooms, like whoa, look at the world, and you're like this like enlightened being because you don't know anything.
Yeah.
But then when puberty hits you, all of a sudden your primitive self just goes into high gear,
Hmm.
and that's when you perhaps have the most primitive self taken over. But depending on your influences, like if you're in a society that really drills into you, hey, I actually need to abide by these values, then
Hmm.
you can emerge into regaining your higher self. But if you're not in that sort of environment that emphasizes doing the right thing, you could continue down that path of having a primitive self.
Yeah, I think those are all really interesting points. And really what it seems like that boils down to, whether it's um, genetic influences, environmental influences, which includes information you're exposed to, people you're exposed to, and you know, everything like that. Really what that boils down to is what the brain structure is of a person. Does that brain structure allow for different thoughts? Like, it is a person predictable in their way of acting and behaving? And maybe that's one, proxy for measuring free will. Like, how predictable are you when it comes to certain situations? Would you behave differently if, I don't know, like
I don't know.
how
I
would you,
don't know if I agree with this because it seems
okay.
like if you're very consistent with your behavior, then by your definition, you would have less free will than someone who does all of these disparate things, so it's hard to predict their behavior. Like if one day I'm really nice to you and the next day I call you like a lying son of a bitch, like that would, like by your definition I would
Yeah.
have more free will. But it really is hard to sort of pin down like what we really mean by free will.
Yeah.
And there is a lot of truth in what Sam Harris says in his
Hmm.
arguments. So, for instance, it's true that when you think of ideas, it's not like you decide that you want to think about something. The thoughts just arise. And anyone who's
Hmm.
spent time meditating has noticed this, where if you're trying to, just focus on your inner self and your own thoughts, you realize that these just are appearances in consciousness that come to you. So that's a lot of the truth in what Sam Harris is saying. But I think where he misses the mark is that he considers that void from which thoughts and ideas and desires arise to be separate from what he considers yourself. But what someone like
Hmm.
Alan Watts would say is that no, you are the undifferentiated void. You are that place from where
Hmm.
subconscious thoughts, ideas, and desires arise.
Yeah. But wouldn't you say that the subconscious thoughts and behaviors that kind of percolate up into consciousness, like that still has to do with the brain structure? And so how would you define free will then? If somebody has more or less free will, like what would you consider a measure of more or less free will? Is that something we can
Well,
even measure or?
I mean, I guess the way I think about it is everyone has their sort of core essence,
Hmm.
like the type of person you are or the type of soul you have, whatever language you want to use.
Hmm.
But and you don't necessarily decide what that is, but I just view it as an emergent phenomenon where you sort of are realizing what type of person you are as you take steps to fulfill that realization. And I sort of
Hmm.
view it as your free will is sort of the degree to which you can hone in on that essence. And a lot of people are sort of blocked by they have all these blockages, so they're not able to realize the type of person that they want to be because they're sort of letting themselves be just influenced by whatever's easiest,
Hmm.
whatever the pressures are environmentally and whatever
Hmm.
else. But if you're able to really have a powerful frequency vibration that is in the direction of whatever your true self is, like I would say that person has more free will than someone who maybe they sort of know what their essence is, but they don't actually take steps to realize it because for whatever reason they're fearful or they're hesitant or their
Huh.
pressures preventing them from doing that.
Okay. So if you are more resistant to outside pressures, then maybe you are more free. Like you're more free from other influences in order to be able to pursue, your essence, as you put
Yeah.
it. Is that
But I
sort of
really
okay?
think that it's hard to think of it as like the concept of free will, I think, is just a really perhaps even the wrong way of framing it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Alan Watts, for instance, talks about the organism hyphen environment, where, so most of the
Mm-hmm.
time we just think of, oh, there's different organisms that are sort of doing their thing. I'm moving around in my house, making coffee, having phone calls, whatever. And then all the empty space is just meaningless. It's just empty space. But you cannot describe an organism without also describing its environment. There's a relationship between the two. And in some sense, it's just one process. And if you zoom back and you just look at everything that's going on Earth, you could view it as one organism that's all sort of working in
Hmm.
concert, in synchronous with one another. So to think of it as, oh, does this specific organism have free will? Like, well, it does and it doesn't. It does have
Yeah.
free will if you view it from the perspective of that organism, but it doesn't have
Mm.
free will if you view it from the macro perspective of, yeah, it's just one of the actors within this larger, situation. And that's why I
Yeah.
really think that rather than framing it as like a dichotomy, do you or don't you have free will, I just view it as like the emergence of the life force. Like we are
Hmm.
that life force, we are the undifferentiated void, and
Hmm.
we're like sort of along for the ride while we're actually driving the ride at the same time. Like we are the Big Bang expanding out into the
Right.
cosmos. And some people are a little more like hesitant, and so their vibration is not as strong, and therefore it doesn't impact the rest of the macro structure as much as some other, like someone like Elon Musk or Joe Rogan or whatever, who
Hmm.
like has a very big microphone and a
Hmm.
very big capacity to move atoms around.
Yeah. Interesting.
But the nature of whether or not they have free will, I think, is the same, where it's just sort of emergent.
Hmm. So is your thought, okay, let me back up. So one of the things we talk about a lot in our utopias of the future is that we want to be able to maximize freedom.
Hmm.
Is that different from free will? So like, do you think that maximizing freedom in these utopian scenarios is really maximizing an individual's ability to pursue their essence? Like, is that sort
Yeah,
of
I would
what
I
you're
would make the
thinking?
distinction between volition or agency and
Mm-hmm.
like the true essence of free will. So, for instance, I would say like you could be some powerful CEO of a tech company, and with the push of a keystroke or just sending one email, you could literally change the lives of millions. But if you're someone who just sort of found yourself in that role because everyone was sort of pressuring you that this is, oh, you make the most money in this job and whatever, and it's not
Hmm.
truly what you want. Like you always wanted to be a jazz musician, but now you're this like tech CEO.
Yeah.
Like I would say, yeah, you have much more volition and agency than the average person, because your sheer ability to impact the world is far greater than some Amazon factory worker who just follows orders.
Hmm.
But your free will, I would say, isn't necessarily greater, because you're not doing what you know in your heart and your inner soul is what you want to be doing. So I would make a distinction between your ability to just impact bits, which I would consider your agency capacity or your volition capacity, versus your free will, which is like how how accurately are you resonating with the essence that in your truest heart of hearts.
Hmm. That's interesting. I think we have like slightly different perspectives on this because I
Okay.
still view free will as sort of the broadness of impact, almost like the volition that you were just describing. Like you have more ability to do different things. Like you're neurochemically more free. And I'm sure there are degrees of free will that are good and bad. Like if you're free will, you have very large range of potential thoughts, but all of those are immoral thoughts. Those are still, that's still more free will than someone who is extremely moral in one very narrow sense. So maybe I'm thinking of free will as not necessarily a good or bad thing. It's just the broadness of potential, essentially, at any
Yeah.
given point.
Yeah, so your
Um,
free will is like my volition or agency, or what I
yeah,
would consider. Yeah.
I suppose so. Um, it's really interesting. It's such a ephemeral topic. Like it's really hard to really pinpoint what even the definition is because I think a lot of people
Yeah.
think of free will a little bit differently. So what are some, one of the articles you sent me recently is, it was an article that said that Sam Harris's argument for free will has been debunked. I'm
Hmm.
curious if you could maybe talk about that because there's so
Yeah.
much argument in this space about whether or not we have free will.
Right, totally. So Sam Harris cites this famous study in his book, which purportedly proves we have no free will. And basically, what the study was is they would have people just tapping their fingers at random intervals, like either finger on their left hand or a finger on their right hand, and then they would simultaneously measure the brain impulses either through EEG or fMRI. And what they found is that you can actually predict what someone's behavior is going to be based on activity in the brain before the person themselves is conscious that they're going to make that decision. So Sam Harris and others have cited this as, see, there is no free will. The action is already set in motion before you yourself decided to do it. So you're basically just realizing what the desires are as they become consciously
Hmm.
present to you, but that desire was already set in motion by the undifferentiated void or whatever.
Yeah.
And this has recently been debunked, I think, in like less than a year ago, because the scientists themselves actually spoke out about what they, how they created this model and what their learnings really were. And it turns out that what they were really measuring were what are now called action potentials. So if I'm thinking that I'm about to move my finger, my neurons fire in a way so that if I do decide to do it, it's ready. Like you could think
Hmm.
of, Serena Williams like throwing up the tennis ball about to do a serve, but then, maybe it's a little bit off, so at the last second she decides to just catch the ball and then,
Hmm.
reset and do another serve.
Yeah.
That is basically she had the action potential ready, and that's what you could measure via fMRI, but then
Hmm.
she decided not to do it. So it's not that it truly proves we have no free will, it just proves that yes, there are measurable action potentials for any potential action that you can do. So to me, this is a knock against Sam Harris's argument. I mean, he brings this up not only once but several times in his book. And he even
Hmm.
says things like, well, if I were able to, bring out a transcript of every single thing that you're about to say right now, wouldn't that prove there's no free will? And it kind of would, but the key is we can't do that. And I think due to quantum uncertainty, I don't think we'll ever be able to do that because you would to be able to predict that with enough
Hmm.
certainty, you would need a model of the whole cosmos, or the whole
Hmm.
universe or something approaching that to truly know. Like I was talking to Kip about this actually,
Hmm.
and he was saying that he thinks it's sort of similar to earthquakes. Like we cannot predict when an earthquake is going to occur. There's just too many variables and too much uncertainty. But we can get really good at sensing the very first movements when the earthquake is set in motion. So I think we'll get better and better at sensing the very first movements in the
Hmm.
process of making a decision or performing an action. But we're never going to be able to know for certain, okay, 10 minutes from now, Justin's going to, get up and shake his right leg because there's
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
too many, like, we would have to model, like, the whole, at least, like, our whole solar system to be able to even get close to predicting something like that.
Yeah, and have a almost, I honestly think you would need a computer the size of Earth to be, or some sort of quantum computer, but to be able to accurately model all of the different,
Yeah.
particles involved in the system. It's ridiculous. And I think it's really interesting because there are um, chaotic events or chaotic systems everywhere. So weather is another chaotic system
Hmm.
where just a minor tweak in the initial inputs dramatically changes the outputs. And we just don't have the capacity to think about these things, and we don't have the capacity to predict chaotic systems. And maybe our brain is a chaotic system, even if, and I think it is a chaotic system, even if you don't take into account quantum physics. Maybe, just like a billiards ball, like really, there's not really that much quantum stuff going on in a billiards ball. You can pretty much use Newtonian mechanics and make good predictions about how that's going to move. And maybe that's the case. But the fact that there are so many neurons and so many connections, that means that like we'll need a ridiculous computer before we can accurately simulate the brain. So yeah, I'm with you there. I don't know if we'll be there in the next several hundred years,
Hmm.
to be able to predict what people are actually going to think and essentially, model out a brain or even the weather, right? That's something that we also struggle with. It might even be a simpler system than the brain. I don't think we
Yeah,
really know. Maybe some people know. I don't know.
yeah. And what's your feeling on whether animals have free will or not? So Sam Harris brings up this example of, for instance, like, you know, an elephant that was at a circus and then it got loose and it trampled people, and then the people got so angry that they ended up lynching the elephant for retribution because the elephant did something morally wrong. It seems like from that example that it's kind of ridiculous to think of an elephant as something that has free will, but
Yeah.
from my perspective, it does have some free will in the same sense that my dog has some free will to not pee on the carpet because it knows from its limited higher self that it's been taught that that's a bad thing to do. But from
Hmm.
its primitive self, it just has to pee right now and it's too lazy. It doesn't want to expend energy walking outside. So I think
Yeah.
in the same sense, there is free will in something like an elephant or a dog, or maybe when you get to like insects and that, there may not be any higher self at all. But I think
Y-
with animals that are farther along the what Tim Urban calls the emergence tower, which you
Yeah.
could start with like a single celled organism, or like below that even like rocks or whatever, and then it
Hmm.
goes all the way up to dolphins, and then like monkeys and humans, and then groups of humans, and then all of humanity, and then the all of Earth's biome, and then the
Hmm.
whole cosmos. And that's like the emergence tower that he refers
Yeah.
to.
Yeah. So I would agree with all of that. I think that there are levels of free will, and sort of like I was saying earlier, in my personal thoughts on free will and my personal definition of free will, I'm thinking of it as brain structure. Now, if your brain structure can be rewired, or if that brain structure has the capacity to do things a little differently. So if you come to the same situation twice, if an elephant, runs across the exact same situation, are they only going to behave in one way, maybe with minor tweaks in the inputs?
But what
I think,
about separate from the brain structure? What if the brain structure stays the same, but you change the environment? So rather than the environment
but
being a cage for the elephant, the environment is the whole African savanna.
right. So in that case, if the brain structure is the exact same, which you would basically have to take the same elephant and just transplant that elephant into a cage, or just keep the
Hmm.
elephant in the savannah. Either way, the neurons and the brain, the neuronal pathways and firing of the neurons is going to be different because the inputs are different. So it's even though it's still the same brain structure, it'll maybe
So
fire a
would the
little bit
elephant
different.
in the cage have less free will than the elephant on the savannah?
I mean, so
It
here's the
seems
thing.
like
I
by
don't
my
know if
definition,
it
the
would be
elephant
more free
wouldn't,
on the
but by your definition,
yeah, because
they would.
if actions themselves are tied into the savannah, if you project out 2 weeks, for example, there's a broader range of things, a broader range of actions and
Right,
thoughts that could occur if that same elephant was on the savannah versus in the cage. And I would view that as
right.
being more free. And maybe free will isn't something that you can just look at in a snapshot. Maybe free will is something where you really do need to sort of project out, or it needs to be over some time period. And maybe, it's just.
Well, I mean, I just view it as you have the free will. So an elephant can still will itself to be free, even if it's in a cage. But I would say its freedom is
Mhm.
seriously constrained in the cage. So to me, the distinction is, what is someone's capacity to will, even if they're not able to actually achieve that objective.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah, I mean that's definitely an argument that makes sense.
yeah. Well, let's talk about some of the other edge cases that Sam brings up. For instance,
Mm,
he brings up Charles Whitman, the
mm,
shooter who killed his wife, his family, and then went to a clock tower and shot like dozens of people. And
mm,
he realized that something might be wrong in his brain, so he actually wrote a suicide note saying, please do an autopsy of my brain and see if anything's going on in there. And they did, and they found a large tumor that was pushing up against his amygdala, which is associated with fear and violence in the
mhm.
brain. And so my question to you is, do you think someone like Charles Whitman has the same degree of free will as someone who we would consider sane and healthy or not?
I would say he did not have as much free will because his brain structure was basically being determined. His pathways were being determined essentially by this invader, this brain tumor that was kind of constraining his thought patterns. So in that sense, I think that was, you know, he was less free, or his free will was much lower than what I would think of in a sane
Right.
person.
And what Sam would say as a follow up, not that I necessarily agree with this position, but he would say then, well, isn't everyone beholden to their particular brain structure, even if it's
Hmm.
considered a healthy, normal brain structure? So isn't
Hmm.
everyone's will totally predetermined by what their brain structure happens to be?
See, I don't think so. I think that brain structure, so our brains are plastic. We can change our brain structures and we can learn new things, we can learn new behaviors. And I think when we do these things, or we can meditate, we can take psychedelics, all of these things will change our thought patterns. Some of them will be more lasting than others. Some can fundamentally change the structure and the connections in our brain. And I think the ability to do that is essentially free will, the ability to change the thought patterns and the path that neurons are firing essentially in your brain
Yeah.
is free will. So, some people have way more free will than others, I think. And I think we all are determined to some extent because we do have a constraint, which is just our um, neurobiology, our brain structure. But beyond that, I
Yeah.
mean,
I
I,
think
I think.
you're really onto something where because what happens moment to moment, how reality continues to emerge as time goes on, that's
Mhm.
really the core of the question of if someone is choosing or having any sort of choice in the matter of how reality occurs, like choose your own
Mhm.
adventure sort of a situation, or if they're
Yeah.
just it's totally determined and you're just a puppet. And
Mhm.
I very much agree with Alan Watts' take on this, where it's neither true that you're a puppet who's just beholden to your strings,
Mhm.
and it's also not true that you're a god who creates your entire reality. Like obviously
Yeah.
it's somewhere in the middle. And I
Mhm.
think part of why Sam is able to make such a compelling argument is that he always uses a specific slice in time, like you were saying, as his
Mhm.
example. Like, oh, so let's say, like for instance, think of a famous person. So think of one.
Just Okay. Do you want me to say
Say
it?
it.
Dolly Parton.
Dolly Parton.
Yeah.
Okay, so were you free to think of that, or were you free to think of anyone else? Like you grew up in the South. I would
Yeah.
never think of that.
Yeah.
So
I don't know
just
why
from
I
the
thought of
simple
that.
fact
Yeah.
that you're from the South,
It
probably
makes me
had
more likely. Yeah. It makes me more
exactly.
likely to think about that.
And
Or the fact that I just saw her in a TV show, or she was referenced in a TV show
right, and you
recently.
didn't decide what the schedule of the TV commercials or TV schedule was, and
Uh-huh.
you probably didn't decide, whether I don't know if you watched TV with someone else at that time or what channel you
Mhm.
chose. Like there are so many situations, so many parts of that situation that you didn't choose. So to say that
Mhm.
you freely decided to think of Dolly Parton is
Mhm.
inaccurate because that thought just merely arose in your mind based on the prior experiences and the prior knowledge that you've had. So
Mhm.
when you think of it in that slice of time, it's really compelling to hear Sam's argument because it's like, well, yeah, it just sort of happened. I didn't have any say in the matter.
Mhm.
But I think the key where it's not doesn't really fully map onto reality is that this is all emerging. So, like it reminds me of a Rumi quote where he
Mhm.
says, "You are not a drop in the ocean. You are the entire ocean in a drop." And it's like you could view yourself as just a mere drop in the ocean, which is sort of what that Sam Harris argument is. Or you could
Mhm.
view yourself as the entire ocean in a drop, where it's like, no, I am that void from which the thought of Dolly Parton arises. And even though I'm not
Mhm.
consciously aware of how the void works or, where these things come from, I still identify with that void, and therefore it was me, even if it's the subconscious me that grows my hair and grows my fingernails and beats my heart. Like it's
Mhm.
still me that is sort of coming up with this, but at the same time, it's not me. And this is the coincidence of opposites that Alan Watts talks about. It's like anytime you
Mhm.
try to describe reality by cutting reality with words and saying this is true, but that other word isn't true. Like there is no free
Yeah.
will or there is free will. Anytime you make a
Hmm.
statement like that, it's not going to be true because you're necessarily cutting reality into pieces. And
Hmm.
both pieces, all pieces in summation, are always going to be the whole truth.
Right. Yeah, and just by the nature of our being is we are moving through time, right? You can't really look at things in a snapshot. You need to know the direction of those things.
And
You
time
can't
is an
just,
illusion too.
oh yeah, yeah.
So like causality is an illusion too. I mean, it's a very useful way to think about things,
Hmm.
but I think emergence is a better way to think about things. Like things emerge together in the same way that like a wave will splash in one direction because there's momentum in that direction, but some of the drops will
Hmm.
go in a different direction.
Hmm.
But you can't say that like each preceding drop caused the next part of the wave. That's not like an accurate way of thinking about it. The wave just
Right.
emerges.
Yeah, but it does, like where a state is previously sort of determines where it is in the future. So like
It
there is
helps
still
predict it.
some, yeah, there is still some time bound thing. And maybe the way we experience time to some extent is an illusion. Um, and I need to look more into that because I'm actually not overly familiar with the argument about time being an illusion. Um, but yeah, I think that, you know, if you just look at a snapshot of things, then you're missing the true picture. You're missing what's happening and what's going to happen. And sure, there's always, this is maybe counter to the fact that everyone talks about living in the present. I don't even know how that ties into all of this. But um,
Yeah.
I think when it comes to free will, you really do need to look at what the direction of your thought patterns are, not just the snapshot of what's happening. And if
Yeah.
there in the future there is a greater variance or a greater variation of potential thoughts, then in my mind that's sort of what it is. And who
Right.
knows? I don't know if that's a useful way to think about it. I don't, and maybe we should talk about that. Like, how useful is it to think that everything is determined? Like, if you don't believe in free will, Is that useful? Is that
Yeah.
bad? Like, is it better to just believe that there is free will even if there's not?
Right. So that's a great question. I think there are some benefits to viewing free will as an illusion, like Sam Harris does. The
Hmm.
biggest benefit from my perspective is that you aren't as hard on yourself psychologically. You don't beat
Hmm.
yourself up as much for saying the wrong thing or doing the wrong thing because you can basically just take refuge in the fact that, well, that's the best thing I thought of, that's the best thing I could do at the time with the
Hmm.
information I had, the inputs I had, the prior experience I've had, and
Hmm.
it's useful to think that, okay, if I ever encounter a similar situation in the future, I'm going to change my behavior.
Yeah.
But
Or do you
it's,
think it makes people maybe they use it as a scapegoat? Like I had no other choice. It was just fate. It's almost like
yeah,
scientific religion, where it's like everything's determined and, you know.
exactly. Well, yeah, this is what. So I was also talking to Kip about this, and he was saying that someone he knows, I won't say who it is, but someone he knows very much takes the path of, well, where God's going to take me whenever he's going to take me, and I'm just going to live my life to the fullest and enjoy it because who knows, I could get hit by a car tomorrow. So this is the kind of guy who, always gets
Hmm.
like spinach and artichoke dip and like multiple beers a night and just lives an unhealthy
Yeah.
life like,
Uh-huh.
but does it from the perspective of, yeah, who knows, like it's in God's hands now. And it's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy because if you take that deterministic viewpoint, then
Hmm.
obviously you're not going to be healthy if you don't willingly decide to eat a salad instead of a
Hmm.
spinach and artichoke dip as an appetizer,
Hmm.
and you do that 10,000 times over. You're shortening your life in a meaningful way.
Hmm.
And so yeah, you don't, I mean, there's definitely a sweet spot, right? You don't want to think of yourself as totally a puppet of God's because then you can allow your primitive self to take over, and it can become an excuse for your primitive self to get what it wants. But you also
Right.
don't want to think of yourself as a god that controls everything because then you'll just destroy yourself psychologically when anything goes wrong. And you want to, this is like someone who's OCD and anxious and they think about every little thing. And if anything goes
Hmm.
wrong, it's like the end of the world to them. So you definitely want that middle path, just like with anything.
Hmm. Yeah, and maybe that's I don't know if there's any other thoughts you have, but maybe we get into the scenarios now.
Sure.
So, Mattimore, what do you think about the worst case?
Worst case scenario.
My worst case scenario is, like many of our worst cases, minimal freedom for people.
Hmm.
I don't know if free will, in the sense that I think of it, can be changed with technology or with society. It may be an inherent part of what it means to be human for as long as we are human. And
Hmm.
for what it means to be an earthling, for that matter, if you think of the Emergence Tower, other animals I would also consider as having free will, but just to a lesser degree because their higher self isn't as developed as human beings' higher self. So I don't know if free will can change, but I do think freedom can change in a fundamental way, which will affect our ability to realize our what
Hmm.
we want from our free will. And it seems to me like part of the worst thing that can happen is we continue to view people's actions and behaviors as being separate from their environmental influences and their biological influences. And so, therefore, we focus more on punishment and retribution rather than
Hmm.
redemption and rehabilitation so you become a better member of society. Like a couple
Hmm.
things, examples that I think are useful. So, one is there's this Yakuza boss who was this just badass, like Japanese mobster who did a
Hmm.
lot of horrible things in his life. But at a certain point, he was a 90-year-old man playing chess in like, New York City, like some park,
Mhm.
and he had his shirt off, and an off-duty cop, recognized his tattoos as being this elusive yakuza boss that they had never been able to capture. So they
Yeah.
put this guy in jail for his crimes, and he hadn't committed crimes in like 40 years at that point. Like all the stuff he did that was bad was in his youth, essentially. And this
Mhm.
guy is a totally like not a threat to society at all. So the question is, should that guy be imprisoned? If you're thinking about it from a punishment perspective, yeah, he should be. This guy did bad things. He's got to answer for it. But if you're thinking about it from like a society safety perspective, it doesn't really change anything if he's in jail or not, if he's truly changed his ways. Then
Hmm.
there's also the perspective of, well, maybe this will help dissuade other people from becoming yakuzas, because we don't want people to think that, yeah, if you make it to your 90s, then we're just not going to go after you anymore. So there's also that just functional, how useful is it to punish people as a way of dissuading future people making the same sort of mistakes. Um,
Hmm.
but another example that's maybe even more on the nose is, I think it was the founder of the Bloods or the Crips. I can't remember which one, but
Mhm.
this guy also had done horrible things in his youth, but then he had a real change of heart in jail, and he actually ended up creating children's books that were to help kids in the hood get out of that way of life and realize that they should become educated and become better members of society. So
Mhm.
this guy, not only had he changed his ways and wasn't doing bad things, he was actively doing good things for society, and yet he was on death row and he was put to death.
Hmm.
So that's a manifestation of the punitive view of free will, and not really considering the fact that this guy didn't decide where he grew up or who his friends, who the kids were that were available to be his friends in his little neighborhood, and what their influences were, and how much
Mhm.
social support were given to that community by the government. Like there's so many factors that aren't taken into account, that I guess in my worst case scenario, it's like we continue with that punitive way of thinking, and it prevents us from really helping people gain redemption and become better members of society on the
Mhm.
one hand. And then the other final thing I'll say about the worst case is that it would be pretty awful if the majority of people just simply have far less ability to realize their desires due to automation and technology. Like, for instance, you can imagine if self driving cars become totally um, omnipresent everywhere, then
Mhm.
your free will to drive where you want, or your volition or agency to be able to drive where you want, essentially approaches zero. Like, you can still choose where you want to go, like you type in the address, but you don't even, maybe you're not even allowed to drive in manual mode, right?
Mhm.
And then if you also, let's say, more and more, I think people are going to work for companies that are managed in an algorithmic way, sort of like Amazon's, manufacturing plants,
Mhm.
where you have a set schedule and your behavior is monitored. And if you deviate from the path at all, that's the greatest productivity path, it'll be noticed and you'll be dinged. And so essentially, you lose all volition and you're just a cog in the machine. And I,
Mhm.
I fear that that is going to be more and more prevalent for most positions. Obviously, there will be some, like if you're Jeff Bezos, you essentially are approaching a god. Like your ability to change the world is greater than any king or
Mhm.
sultan throughout all of human history. But I
Yeah.
worry that for the majority of people, that freedom is going to approach zero. And at the same time, we're not going to have compassion for people's specific situations and influences growing up, and we'll still focus more on punishment rather than
Yeah.
understanding.
Yeah. A lot of good stuff there. I think the retribution thing is a real issue, and there needs to be a path to redemption for these people. And it is sort of a gray area. Like, at what point do we transition from, like, we can't just let people roam free. Like, there needs to be some way to know what a person is likely to do in the future, right? We need to know if they are moral, like if their decisions will lead to a better outcome for society going forward. Because I feel like a lot of people get into that sunk cost fallacy. Like they did this,
Hmm.
so they need to like pay for this. And maybe that's not sunk cost, but it's related,
Hmm.
where like the past doesn't even matter anymore. We need to figure out what is the best way to proceed. Can this person redeem themselves by helping, you know, young kids in the hood not get into the gang scene, or young Japanese people not get into, the Yakuza.
Hmm.
I think there's a lot of ways that that 90-year-old man could have helped in that case, the same way that the guy in jail that was the leader of the Bloods or Crips that you mentioned.
Hmm.
So, anyways, I think those are all good points. The worst case that I was mostly focused on was how technology is shaping our behavior, and and we talked about this in the future of advertising, I believe,
Hmm.
where
Distraction too, I think.
and distraction, but the point that I was thinking is companies need people to be in boxes and to have predictable behaviors, because if they do, then they're easily marketed to, and that is ad revenue. And I
Hmm.
think the way that incentives are in companies today is they're essentially shaping people's behavior. Or for app like games or anything really where there's some sort of interaction, like YouTube, it's really shaping your behavior and it's altering your brain structure when you are rewarded for, interacting in an aggressive way on YouTube or Facebook, or posting really inflammatory articles. Then you're going to keep doing that. And if companies are rewarded for that and people make money from posting these clickbait articles, then I think it's just shaping people's brain structures, actually. Because if people are trained to do certain things and behave in a certain way, it's actually reducing the the free will of these people, just in my definition of free will, which is,
Hmm.
less freedom of thought, essentially. Like the way that you think is completely predictable. And I think in the worst case, this is taken to the extreme. So, the worst case is actually very close to what I think China is at right now, where
I was
they're
thinking the same
they're
thing.
altering they're altering people's behaviors on a
Re-education
mass
camps.
scale. Yeah, re-education and all of these things that they're doing, and like making people afraid to behave in a certain way. And it's just training people to be less and less, or to have less and less freedom in their thoughts. Like they have to behave in a very specific way. And I think that's pretty much the worst case. If that spreads, that's the worst case. If
Yeah.
it spreads to everywhere else
Well,
in the world.
are you familiar with the Overton window, with that concept?
Uh, I've heard the concept, but I don't remember what it is.
So the Overton window is basically the set of acceptable opinions.
Mm,
And so,
okay.
for instance, is gay marriage okay? Is it not okay? Like that has shifted over time, where in the
Hmm.
1950s, it was very extreme to think that gay marriage was okay. Now it's more extreme to think that gay marriage isn't okay. Or like another example
Okay.
is smoking harmful? Like it used to be extreme to think that smoking was harmful. Now it's
Hmm.
extreme to think that it's safe. So
Yeah.
the Overton window changes with public opinion, but what's really nefarious is when the Overton window of what people are allowed to say is fundamentally different from what they actually believe. And that's what you get in a situation like China or especially Hong Kong,
Hmm.
where people may have these beliefs that, oh, I value democracy, I value free speech, I want to be able to read whatever book I want to read. But you
Hmm.
can't say that. You can't post that on WeChat and not expect any sort of
Right.
repercussions. So essentially, you're limiting the speech that people are able to do, and you have a warped like speech bubble compared to the Overton window, because the Overton window is like way over here of what's acceptable, but what people's beliefs are maybe are more in the middle.
Hmm.
And that's like a truly worst case scenario where you can't even say or think what you believe because it's just not accepted.
Right. Yeah, and I seriously think that that is related to free will. Like when all of these, and eventually maybe that means that people start to actually think these ways. They start to, you know, think in line with what they're being told they need to believe. And that, I
Right.
think, that's a really a really worst case scenario. Um, so anyways, let's get a little more positive. What do you think about the best case?
Best case scenario.
My best case scenario is that the Overton window matches people's actual beliefs
Mm,
and how we think, so how we come up with ideas is based on the higher self as opposed to the primitive self. So I really think this is one of the most important distinctions where
hmm.
it's so obvious to see anyone who's behaving like their primitive self. Even we posted on Instagram about certain gurus that even though they may be enlightened in the sense that they know the nature of the self and the nature of reality and they're in tune with the present moment, even these people can behave horribly where they sexually assault their followers and they get
Hmm.
drunk with power and money. But it's always very obvious when you see someone who's overtaken by their primitive self because it's basically just they're doing whatever their biological primitive needs are. Like it's sex, it's money, it's power, it's not caring
Hmm.
about the truth, but just caring about what's good for you. And,
Yep.
even someone like Trump, like it's so clear that this guy is just driven by his primitive self. But because that primitive self is so strong and it resonates with other people's primitive selves, and they can sort of band together as this like colossus so that they have safety in numbers, and the truth is
Hmm.
really not that important. It's just whatever's good for the tribe because you're a part of that
Right.
tribe and that's what gives you safety and refuge. Like
Hmm.
if we can move away from that and move towards a society that's governed by the higher self, where it's not as important what's good for you personally, it's more important what's true. And pursuing truth and beauty in the purest sense,
Hmm.
regardless of what's good for your personal biological needs, the more we can get towards that, I would
Yeah.
say the better. And just uh, also, as far as some of the worst case scenario points, we focus more on rehabilitation and redemption rather than punishment. So if
Yeah.
someone's no longer a threat to society, we let them have a chance to redeem themselves. If someone is still a threat to society and they don't show signs of changing, we obviously want to keep them contained. And I think the other thing I would say in my best case scenario is that we need to make it easy to be a good person, easy to follow your higher self, and really hard to follow your primitive self and your lower self. And there are certain professions where it's the opposite. Like, for instance, if you're in politics, and I have friends who are good friends who are in politics, it's hard to not become corrupt if you've been working in politics for 20 plus years. It's really
Hmm.
hard because
Hmm.
the whole political system is about selling influence. Like
Yeah.
you basically have some amount of influence, and then the highest bidder, whether they're lobbyists or super PACs or whatever, they donate to your campaign so that they can have a chunk of your influence. And that's like all primitive mind thinking. It's like what's good for me, what's going to allow me to succeed in my career so I can provide for my family and get the highest quality mate for to pass on my genes.
Yeah.
Like even with I think lawyers too have a little bit of that nefariousness just because the legal system works where you need to give the best defense possible even if you know someone actually did like your client actually did the crime. So it does sort of
Mm.
warp a lawyer's like sense of
Yeah. At least like defense lawyers or, people that
yeah.
are, because I know there are some lawyers that just won't work with,
Well, also
you
like
know,
the legal system's just if you have lots of money, you can essentially buy yourself get out of jail free
yeah.
card. Whereas if you
Yeah.
can't, so like the whole system also I think is really broken with with law. Um, but
Yeah.
other systems are much better.
Yeah.
So I guess
Well, what do
my
you think about education? It seems like education is also one that really lowers free will if you're told exactly what you need to think. Um,
yeah, our education system needs
yeah,
to be totally overhauled because we're still basically teaching people how to become like middle managers who are cogs in a corporate
yeah,
machine in like the 90s,
hmm
where you're like writing memos and you don't have to think much for yourself. You're really good at your one little task of like writing memos and sending it and like entering things into a spreadsheet, but you don't actually think high level of what needs to
right.
happen. And so yeah, I think education needs to change. And yeah, I mean, I would just say that if we can get more towards that higher self
hmm
and move everything in the direction of what pursues truth and beauty as opposed to what pursues personal gain for any individual, that's going to allow us to really succeed and flourish in the future.
hmm Yeah, I think those are all good. And for mine, it's sort of the inverse of what we were saying with the worst case. So with in terms of redemption, retribution, rehabilitation, I think in the best case there are extremely good systems, whether that's through some sort of AI, through some sort of really strong, psychiatry, something along those lines to really get somebody to a place to where their thought patterns are freer, but also freer in the direction of morality. And kind of like I was saying earlier, like you can have a lot of free will, but if all of your thought patterns lead to negative, immoral things, that it's not a good thing. But you could have a lot of free will where your thought patterns always lead to, or at least very reliably lead to, extremely moral behaviors and moral thoughts. And I think that if we have systems in place, like you said, to make being a good person easier, and just
Hmm.
really altering the environment, which is information. So that's like almost changing the incentive structures of companies. Maybe advertising in the far future is not like what we see today. Maybe it's something that, you know, I don't know how business would be promoted without advertising. I don't know what the alternative business structure or business model is
Well,
for.
I don't think, yeah, I mean, advertising can definitely be improved. But the key to me is if what you're stating is actually true in some real sense versus
Right.
if it's manipulation.
Yeah, so maybe advertising isn't the issue, and maybe it's more the apps, the technology that really drive behavior. So maybe that's more of like the YouTubes and the Netflixes that are driving behavior because they're really incentivized to keep people engaged with the app and
Right.
reliably engaged with the app and predictably engaged with the app. And I think when that's the case, we kind of are approaching a worst case. But in the best case, companies or the whole system, the whole world is kind of incentivized to get people to be more diverse in their thought, to be more open to different things, maybe to learn a whole bunch of different topics and
Right.
fields. And I think when we do stuff like this, and if society can, be like this, then free will is maximized, but we also have a system where the free will that people have is maximized in a moral sense, right? So like there's more diversity of thought in a,
Yeah. I would say there should be diversity of what we think, but not in
yeah,
how we think. I think if everyone is taught the scientific method of thinking,
yeah,
then that's much better than everyone coming out with their own dogmatic way of looking at things. And I would say, just to build on your point, that if we can really help nourish the higher self when people are younger, they're going to have much more freedom to achieve not only what they want, but what society wants, as opposed to if we nourish their primitive self. So, for
Hmm.
instance, like if you're a little kid and you hear your parents yelling and you ask your mom, why were you guys yelling? In one case, your mom could say, "Oh, your dad's just an asshole. He only cares about himself." Like that statement will nourish your primitive self. But if instead your
Hmm.
mom says, when two people love each other, you don't always have the same beliefs, and sometimes you get emotional, but it doesn't mean you love each other any less, and this is part of what it means to,
Hmm.
find a path that works for both your dad and me.
Yeah.
That statement nourishes your higher self. So the more we can do, either on individual, family, societal, company level, to nourish the higher self as opposed to the primitive self, the better everything will be.
Hmm. Okay. And does the higher self tie into free will in that it's like the choices that you can make are just, but, well, actually, I'm curious. Does it tie
Yeah,
in
well,
like,
I mean, so the way that Tim Urban defines it is your quote inner self is
mhm.
your primitive self plus your higher self. And people have
Okay.
different percentages. Like one person, like Alan Watts is probably like, I mean, he's dead now, but he was probably like 99% higher self, 1%, or maybe like 5%.
Yeah.
Like he still liked drinking wine and having sex and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And then someone else like Trump is like the opposite. He's like 95% primitive self, like 5% higher self. And
Okay, so
so your
I
true
see.
self is both,
I
but
see.
I think thinking of free will in this way of do you or don't you have free will is just not the right way of framing it. It's more like who
Right.
you are emerges both with what your inner desires are as they arise from the undifferentiated void and
Okay.
what the environments are that interact with you as an open system. And so that all emerges together, but I don't think you can think of it accurately in the way of, what is your, do you or don't you have free will? It all is emerging in real time.
Right. Okay, so that's sort of a different way of saying, your brain structure. Is your brain structure like more
But it's not just your brain
constant?
structure, it's also everything outside your brain. It's the whole
Yeah,
organism hyphen environment.
right. I guess the way I think about it is the brain structure is it responds to your environment. It's kind of
Yeah.
like the
But is it
the
just your
self.
brain structure? Because you do thinking in other parts of your body as well.
Well, okay,
You
yeah,
have a
like your
magnetic
neurological
field, you've got,
structure.
yeah, so it's like,
Yeah,
it's hard to say, like, oh no, it's just what's in your brain and that's what determines free will. Like, I think that's
yeah.
inaccurate.
Okay, like I do agree with that. So
Like,
maybe
you
it's
have
more like your
neurons
whole
in your
body.
stomach, you know?
Yeah. You have and nerve
Yeah.
endings everywhere.
But then
Like
it's
all of
like,
these things are part of it.
right, and it's like, where does your self end? Like, Alan Watts talks about the bag of skin, where most people think of themselves as just what's inside their skin. And
Hmm.
that's like the illusion of being totally separate from your environment. But if you actually looked at what was going on, you're mostly like empty space, and you just have these molecules that are vibrating at very high speeds to make it seem like you have this physical um,
Yeah.
barrier between the outside world and the inner world. But you also emanate heat, you emanate a magnetic field, so
Yeah.
it's kind of useful to think about yourself as separate, but in another sense, you and your organism are just one process that's arising and emerging at the same
Hmm.
time.
Got it. Yeah, I think those are interesting. So maybe to wrap it up, what do you think of the likely scenario?
Most likely scenario.
My most likely scenario is that there is no free will in a particular sense, like the way that it's such a hard thing to talk about.
Yeah, I
Um,
agree.
and it's also hard when people seem to have different senses of what is meant by free will. But
Yeah,
I
I
would,
mean, just you and I seem to have a slightly different
right.
interpretation of it. Yeah.
But I would say the most likely scenario, just considering what the future. Well, first I'll say what I think free will actually
Hmm.
is, and I think what's most likely is that just the notion of free will may be misplaced, and it's sort of like everything's emerging at once. But as far as like your volition and your agency and how it's going to change in the future, I do think for the majority of people, they're going to have less volition and agency in the perhaps short to medium term as we make this transition where I think inequality is going to grow. There are going to be some people who have godlike abilities to move bits and move
Mhm.
people's thoughts and opinions, whereas the majority of people will have far less ability and they'll be more of a cog in the machine. But I also think that it's somewhat likely that in the far future, we could have free volition and agency like never before. Like, imagine if every person, when you get to be 18, you have a decision of do you want to keep living in this base reality or do you want to go into your own simulation where you can literally be God or create whatever type of world you want with whatever ethical norms
Mhm.
and outer manifestations and like or for instance like far future if we actually colonize the cosmos in some way or find wormholes or it's like we could each be the king of our own planet and so I
Yeah.
think when you go far future our free will could like exponentially increase but when we look at just based on past trends how people's volition is going to be able to change in the coming years I think it's going to be a major dichotomy between some people that have way more ability to impact
Mhm.
reality and others who are mostly just a minor cog in the machine.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I'll make one additional point on a trend that I think we're seeing in both the West and the East, which is so in the West, we're seeing um, a lot of people maybe on the far left that are really into censorship, right?
Mm-hmm.
I feel like there's a lot of movement towards that right now on college campuses, on a lot of highly liberal and supposedly open um, places. We're seeing this censorship of ideas just because they're censoring ideas that are not what they agree with, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And then in places like China, we're seeing censorship for control. But I ultimately think that we're seeing this control and this censorship spread everywhere, not just in China. And it's potentially something that could have a really huge short-term impact. I really don't think systems like this can last long term. I think that there will always be, some sort of revolution that strikes up and people are like, "Oh shit, like this isn't right. I don't think we should be controlled this way." And then maybe at that point, free will, if we're talking about free will, maybe it starts to take a dip a little bit as there's more and more control and censorship and like manipulation of thoughts and ideas or difference between the Overton window and your actual thoughts,
Mm-hmm.
like you were saying earlier. And in the far future, like you said, I believe that we will rebound from whatever trends we're seeing now. I do think we're sort of still on a downslope in terms of censorship here in the West, but you also see places like Hong Kong that are resisting that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think
Yeah.
eventually, whatever happens, there will be a resistance to censorship and manipulation and control of thoughts and ideas and the limitation of free will. So anyways, I think that's another thought in the likely scenario. But my other likely scenario was pretty much what you said. Like in the future, there's limitless possibility,
Mm-hmm.
but we do kind of need to get over this little or get through this valley and this dip of the loss of free will and freedom
Right.
of thought in the
Yeah,
short
and,
term.
and I would just recommend for listeners that you shouldn't think of free will as something that is so ingrained in you that you really need to beat yourself up about any mistake that you made because it is true what Sam says that you didn't pick any of your influences leading up to that moment. But you also shouldn't think of yourself as someone who's just a puppet and just let yourself,
Hmm.
live a life where your primitive urges take over and you eat
Hmm.
poorly, you don't exercise, and So I think just with anything, it's helpful to take that middle path. But at the same time, I think it's fantastic that Sam Harris wrote that book, because it's good to be discussing these topics, and he opened up a conversation that's really important for us to be having, especially given the changes in censorship and free speech that you referred to. So
maybe that's a good place to wrap it up. Those are great recommendations.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for listening. Thank you, James, for recommending this topic. This has been the Future of Free Will, and we'll see you next time.
The past, the present, and the future.
Our computer is picking up a strange signal.
The past, the present, and the future, baby.
What's the world coming to?
The past, the present, and the future. The past, the present, and the future, baby. The past, the present, and the future.
Will attempt to stimulate consciousness.
The past, the present, and the future, baby.
Behind the strange signal is an alien
The
intelligence.
past, the present, and the future. The past, the present, and the future, baby.
It's possible.
Hey futurists, if you've made it this far, you might be wondering who created the Hence the Future theme song. It was created by the Walden Brothers, and you can find them on Spotify. The Walden Brothers also produced the sound bites for the worst case, the best case, and the most likely future scenarios. At Hence the Future, we're always looking for ways to improve the quality of our episodes and our predictions. To that end, we're building a team of researchers to curate the most authoritative and highly vetted sources as the foundation for every episode. If you'd like to support these efforts, you can donate a small monthly amount at anchor.fm/hencethefuture. And if you haven't done so already, please rate and review the podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. We appreciate your support.